Hello, my name is Michael Francisco. I lead developer marketing for GitHub. Thank you for inviting me to join you today. I'm looking forward to speaking with you about GitHub, about open source, about developer velocity and inner sourcing, and how all of these things come together to help you deliver better innovation to your customers. A little bit about myself. I live just outside of Seattle, Washington, and currently at home with my family in isolation. If you hear noises outside the door while I'm talking, just know that that's my family and it's probably highly expected. If there's any questions you have after the presentation, I'll provide my contact information at the end, and please feel free to reach out. I'm happy to continue the discussion and help in any way that we can. Thank you.
So today we're going to talk about open source, inner source, and developer velocity. The structure of this conversation is we're going to start a little bit talking about open source and open source growth in the greater Chinese region. We're going to talk a little bit about what we can learn from open sourcing and how that contributes to this philosophy and culture and approach that we call inner sourcing. We're going to talk about inner sourcing, define it, come to a common agreement on what inner sourcing is, what it means, and then talk about what does it mean to actually be effective at implementing inner source within your organization and why you would want to do that. All of this accrues to developer velocity. Developer velocity is a concept and a idea that we talk a lot about, which is really focused on how do we help developers do their best work? How do we empower them in a way that makes the environment that they work in more collaborative? How do we keep them focused on the tasks and code that's really important to them and that keeps them engaged both internally and as part of their contributions to the open source community? And then also, how do we think about really freeing them up to focus on those pieces of your code that differentiate you from the rest of the market? Developer velocity is an important concept and one that I think this whole conversation today accrues to, and we'll talk more about as we go through. Let's start a little bit talking about open source in the greater Chinese region. GitHub is a global community, but 80% of developers on GitHub live outside of the United States. This chart here shows the size of the developer communities relative to the whole around the world. As you can see, China is the second largest developer community on GitHub. They make up about 14% of the total platform. And while being a big portion of the community, they're also a very active part of the community. Chinese developers in the last year made over 5.5 million contributions through GitHub to software. And so it's important to note that not only is this a growing community, but it's an active community, and we're really excited to see this development and growth over time. If we get a little bit more discrete and talk about just APAC, China makes up about 34% of the developers in APAC. About 34% of those are Chinese developers on GitHub. Again, it's a great growth and great story about how active this community is. And when we talk about growth, I'm going to throw a number out at you. This number is 37%. 37% is the growth rate of the community over the developer community over the last 12 months on GitHub in China. For context, this is the fastest growth rate in the world, faster than even the United States that came in at 22%. And the United States has the world's largest developer base locally. So if you think about that, it's growing faster than the United States with the smaller developer community. We're really excited to continue to see this growth in China in their participation in open source. And we take a look at some other countries that are in the greater Chinese region. As you can see, Hong Kong is, for the second year in a row, the fastest growing region in the world by percentage of increase in contributors at 175% growth year over year. This is general contributions to software through GitHub. And as you can see, it's far and beyond the number 2 entry, Singapore, and it's a great mark that they've been able to do this for 2 consecutive years. If we talk about the growth in open source contributors, so these are developers that are contributing to open source code specifically. Hong Kong again comes in at the top of the list, but we start seeing other folks in here as well. Taiwan is also in the top 10 as we look at this group. So it's exciting to see just kind of the general impact and growth of open source contributors and communities within GitHub, within the greater Chinese region. When we look at the importance of open source code, and we want to talk a little bit about why it's important that we're seeing such great contribution to open source from the communities in the greater Chinese region. Part of that is that open source plays a very significant and important role in the software development world at large. To highlight that point, I want to call out that 99% of projects, this is all software projects that have over 1,000 lines of code in them, have at least one open source dependency within them. And if we look on average across all software that has open source in them, or every software project, and you look at the dependencies that support those projects, on average, open source projects have over 150 dependencies, open source dependencies as part of a single project. So you start accruing this. It's not just one piece of open source software that's sitting in these code bases. It's one piece of open source software supported by over 100 different open source dependencies that kind of bring that project together. So you start thinking about the broad implications of all of these projects coming together to bring this one dependency into a code base. It's a great kind of global effort from the developer community to make this sort of work possible. And it really is a demonstration of how the community and the work the community does is a great example of the world's largest team sport. We couldn't do these things individually, but the community together has figured out how to get it done, and it's an important contribution to the world of software development. Take this a step further. If you look at the modern software supply chain, 80 to 90% of the code comes from open source. This means that the average modern software code base is made up of 80 to 90% of open source components. That means that from a differentiation standpoint, the differentiation between one software project, one code base, and another really exists in that 10 to 20% of proprietary code. And you think about being able to develop software in a way that kind of makes you an innovator in your space, or really kind of drives those very unique, very enjoyable, very delightful customer experiences. By taking your same developers and focusing them on that 10 to 20% of code, you're really allowing them to focus on the stuff that really, really matters instead of reinventing the wheel. You're taking those resources that might previously been spent kind of rebuilding things, NPM libraries and things like that your developers would need in order to deliver that kind of last mile piece of software to customers. Now we can work with the open source community to bring those pieces in, leverage the strength of the community and hundreds and thousands of hours of development already completed, bring that into your project and allow your developers to think about and focus on those pieces of their proprietary code that really differentiate you from the competition. While the contribution of dependencies and source components and software to these broader projects is really important, it's not the only thing that we can glean and take away from open source. One of the things that we can gain from open source is learning. We can take and learn from the fact that open source is a distributed community of developers that work together to build important software. They figured out how to work effectively, asynchronously, across languages and across time zones to come together to build very important, very complex, essential pieces of software used by the rest of the world. These communities, while they maybe not have ever met in person, are efficient, they're organized, they don't share an office, nor do they share an IT department, but somehow they've managed to figure out how to share, reuse, code, and harness the skills of their peers to get work done. As we think about the modern software team, it's really important to be able to look at how have these groups organically been able to organize themselves, take those learnings and bring them inside of your development teams. Whether your developers are sitting 5 feet, 10 feet apart, or they're sitting half a world apart, they suffer from some of the same challenges the open source community suffered, understanding how to really work together and break down silos so that their best work could get done and the best skills could be leveraged in the right situations, and they weren't repeating work. Instead, they were using the work each other was doing to build on top of it, springboard into that next project, and really advance software development as a practice. So what is inner sourcing? I want to take a moment to pause and talk about what is inner sourcing. As a definition, inner sourcing takes the lessons learned from developing open source software and applies them to the ways that companies develop software internally. Full stop. When we think about inner sourcing, this is the definition that GitHub uses to think about what it means to be effective at inner sourcing, what it means to target an inner sourcing project. It's about learning from the open source community, bringing those practices inside your organization, and implementing them in an effective way that helps your developers expand and increase their velocity, while also helping you innovate faster and deliver better experiences to your customers. So how do we do this, and what are the problems that we're solving for? We'll talk about that. Let's take a step backwards for a second. It should be clear to everybody by now that developers are at the core of innovation. Developers and developer talent is the key to helping us unlock innovation at scale and are key to actually delivering great value to our customers. In order to empower our developers and allow them to do their best work, we've had to solve some problems in the way organizations are organized. When we started about 10 years ago, DevOps became a topic, and DevOps was really a focus on how do we remove the barriers between our development teams and the operation teams that spun up the environments they needed to build, test, and deploy software. DevOps was an effort to bring these groups together to simplify that process, provide more consistency for developers, and put them in better control in the environments they needed to go do their best work. As we think about DevOps, there's kind of 4 key practices that we talk about. One of them is collaboration. GitHub is the home for developer collaboration. We were a platform that was built from the start as focused on solving the problem of allowing a distributed team of folks working on a very complex software project to be able to work asynchronously. We are the home of the pull request and the GitHub flow and kind of the way that this pull request workflow that developers love works. And this notion of social coding was born out of GitHub and this desire to solve this collaboration problem. And everything that we've invested in on the platform over time has really been focused on simplifying collaboration. The next piece of this is workflows and automation, establishing consistent patterns and pathways for developers to do their work, and then automating that, taking away the manual time that they spend pushing buttons or to start a new process or moving code around. Through workflow automation, we've taken those manual tasks away and given time back to developers to focus on writing code and solving real challenging problems that they find enjoyable and that they find challenging and useful for the business. Security and compliance, working security and compliance into your workflows and understanding how to simplify the process of managing not only security within your code base, but managing the security that's related to the dependencies that you're pulling from the open source community, being able to more accurately identify those vulnerabilities and their variants, and also being able to quickly remediate problems that you've identified or that might be coming in through an open source dependency. Understanding your security and compliance workflows and being good at quickly identifying and remediating is a key practice for DevOps. And finally, continuous improvement. Being able to leverage all of these practices to kind of provide the ability to do continuous integration on your code instead of moving from biannual shipments of software, being able to ship multiple times a day and thinking about how we're continuously rapidly iterating to improve our code base and then improve our processes that allow us to ship and deliver code. All 4 of these are key practices that help move organizations forward. The challenge with all of this is that despite the fact that a lot of folks understand this and they invest in DevOps, we know that 93% of DevOps implementations are not optimized, meaning that organizations that have invested money in DevOps are not seeing the returns that they could or should be seeing out of those investments, and therefore are not seeing the returns in relative to speed of delivery, security, or kind of innovation on the back end. And the reason for that is that DevOps alone is not enough. You can't just put tools and systems in place and expect it to fix all of your development challenges. No matter how many tools and systems you put in place, your organizations are still working in silos. You can put people together, close together physically, or you can put them on Slack all day long, but there's still breakdowns between organizations that need to be working together to learn from each other. And that's not just small developer teams, we're talking across your organization. I want to illustrate this as an example for you. This is what your organization might look like, or a small part of your organization. And oftentimes organizations struggle from the concept of Conway's Law. Conway's Law is organizations which build systems are constrained to produce designs which are copies of the communication structures of those organizations. So if your ability to communicate within your organization follows the structure of your organization, you are naturally not allowing your organization to communicate or work together as smoothly as they possibly could. This might be how it works for you. Your organization is broken into units, and within a given unit, it's easy to communicate. But what happens when you need to collaborate outside of that unit? It might look something like this, where you have this kind of convoluted communication chain, and it makes it difficult for folks to be able to actually communicate and do the work they need to do, and the people that are valuable relative to skills or experience or knowledge might be left out of that loop. And then if you try to bring that person in, something gets lost in the translation. And how does collaboration happen in this environment? Well, the truth is it truly can't. And you can work harder, you can try to do unnatural things to drive communication, but this structure of an organization relative to how communication happens in Conway's Law makes it difficult for you to get kind of big changes and big returns on those collaborating events. What happens then if you have a much larger organization and you have 3 people that need to figure out how to work together because they have similar interests in either knowledge or the problems that they're trying to solve? The ability to collaborate across those groups, be able to find each other, be able to learn from the work that they're all doing is nearly impossible. So we need to figure out a way to figure out how to solve this organizational distancing and bring developers closer together, bring their work closer together so that we can help them collaborate more effectively. Again, this is the problem that the open source community has naturally solved in order to help it continue to develop software that the world is leveraging to help move their own software projects forward. So let's talk for a minute about how this happens. What are the things that we need to do in order to effectively introduce inner sourcing into our organization and solve some of the challenges that we were talking about? We're talking a minute about inner sourcing fundamentals. There are 4 goals of inner sourcing that we want to really focus on. One is we want to focus on reuse. We want to reuse the code and the knowledge that is happening within one part of your organization in another part of your organization. If you have a team that has built a specific component that's unique to your code base, you don't want another team to be building that same component. You want to be able to share those things. You want to be able to provide the access to that code in a secure manner so that code that needs to be locked down because of PII or compliance restrictions, or whatever that might be, you want to be able to share that appropriately across your organization so people feel free to share code openly and be able to use it in their various projects without having to recreate the wheel. The second piece is collaboration. We want to encourage collaboration across your organization, solving for the problem that we just talked about, not reducing that organizational distance to bring people closer together to work on code together and bring their shared and unique insights to these projects. We want to build community. We want people to work together and celebrate that working together, learn from each other's successes and learn from each other's failures and come together as a community to celebrate that and share it so that we're constantly all getting better based upon the work of our peers. And finally, the last goal is to, as I mentioned earlier, really increase developer velocity. Allow people to get to that state where they're moving as fast as they want to, being able to focus on those projects that are interesting to them and really bringing up developer satisfaction, which in turn results in better work, faster work, and greater innovation for your customers. In the end, the goal is to build better software faster. As we think about open source, or inner sourcing, taking the open source learnings and applying them to your organization through inner sourcing, there's kind of 5 things that I think are important for us to consider as we look at bringing inner sourcing into your organization. The first one is that you want to create an open environment. You want to create a level playing field for the open sharing of work. You want to create transparency. You want to ensure that the process as well as the product is visible to folks as they're working through their projects. You want to make a participative environment, make it easier for others to collaborate together. Again, reducing that organizational distancing. We want it to be collaborative, increase quality by increasing quantity, people working together, sharing their code, sharing their work, and all kind of building upon each other in an exponential way to help drive greater change, faster iteration, and more frequent ships that result in value to your customers. And lastly, you want to think about it being governed. You can't do any of this without having some governance over the process. You don't want to create a wild, chaotic environment, but what you want to do is put in enough controls, clear goals, and support to help your organizations apply these tenets in a way that really drives towards a consistent goal, keeps your company in compliance, and allows you to have some structure while driving this collaboration and this inner sourcing. So let's dive into each of these just a little bit. First one is open. As we think about open, what does this mean? Well, first, in repositories, it's being able to find prior art, and that prior art isn't possible to be found if it's not open in the first place. So we need to make sure we're opening up our repositories in a thoughtful way. We want to reuse as much as possible. This could be an argument for more microservices. Well, that's a whole other conversation. But we want to be able to be people to reuse pieces and components of code that others have built so they don't have to recreate the wheel. And lastly, you want to be able to have contributions. Forking workflows can be cumbersome, so you want to avoid it if you can, but you want to give people permissions with protections to be able to leverage, to be able to create branches, be able to leverage those branches to improve on them and use them in other projects. You want to make sure that you're governing that in the right way, and you want to be able to make sure that you're opening up the organization for contributions from others who can add value to projects. Transparent. You want to ensure that the process as well as the product is visible. Being able to see the description of how something like a deployment process works is great. It's a valid documentation. This is valid documentation beyond just explaining what a function does, but the communication about how a feature was made, that's important too. Take this example. Somebody makes the comment, we should switch over to MySQL. The response is, we tried that earlier and it didn't work. The response, okay. There's something that's missing here. This is not the way that communication should happen, because without the transparency, people don't understand why that decision was made and may either then dismiss it and lose sight of a valuable learning, or they might not have the context they need to make their own decision for their own organization. This is what it should look like. I want to switch to MySQL. We tried that. And by the way, take a look at this GitHub issue that explains why we made this decision. User reads. Now they have context for why that decision is made, and they can make an educated decision about how that decision was made and whether or not it applies to their organization, or if there's something they can learn from that that helps influence their decision in a meaningful way so that they can make the right business decision. So transparency, not just about the product, but also about the process, is super important for helping make sure that we're sharing information in the right way. And finally, development. We want to make sure the process as well as product is visible, but this one is also about pull requests and code review. We want to collaborate while the code is being written, surface concerns early, and reduce the churn. This is what GitHub was built for, being able to create pull requests to make suggestions and comments within code that can quickly be merged back into the branch so that developers can work together asynchronously to make sure they're all kind of providing their input and building the best software possible with the right checks through their CI/CD workflows to make sure that everything works as it's intended before it gets deployed to the customer. So this is great. We've got a lot of new information if we're opening up repositories and giving people access. But just because people have a lot of information doesn't mean they can magically now participate in the process. In order to be effectively participative, we need to think about the roles of individuals within the organization, similar to the way we think about them in the open source community. At the top end of this funnel, we should think about this as kind of a transparency funnel, being able to share the right information with the right folks at the right levels of the organization. As we think about this funnel, think about this in the context of open source community. This funnel is really small at the bottom where we have our open source maintainers or maintainers of specific projects within your organization. This is usually just a handful of people, handful of experts that have the ability to make the final decision about what gets included in the code that they want to publish. A layer above this is the contributors. These are people that are actually writing code, creating pull requests, writing suggested changes and things like that actually improve the code that the maintainers then decide what goes into the final shipment. And above this is the users. These are the people that use this code. They might reuse it as a dependency. They might make suggestions, but they're probably not contributors. But this is a much broader set of folks. At each of these layers, there's a different level of transparency that is required in order to effectively allow these people to work. For the users, we want to make sure it's a low barrier to entry for these folks in terms of discovery. Make it easy, sometimes with dashboards or projects, as well as installation of the project. We want to make it easy for them to get the base level information they need to be able to install and use the product effectively, and then create a feedback loop where they can provide information and feedback back to the contributors and maintainers who are taking responsibility for improving on the project over time. You want to make it easier for others to collaborate together. For contributors, they're doing things like opening issues, improving docs, offering insight and conversation, unsolicited improvements, and working on backlogs. Ultimately, you want to reduce the friction required to submit feedback, get up and running, make sure things are even working, and finding ways to contribute. Then you'll have more contributors, and you'll have a much more engaging relationship with the community and a larger number of folks contributing to the success of your projects. And the last one is the maintainers. You want to make it easy for others to collaborate and reduce the friction, and that is done by the maintainers. These maintainers set the vision, document some process, They set, maintain the tone on conversations, they approve, they collaborate, they deny submissions from contributors, and they facilitate the shared ownership of the project. The maintainers are the ones that set the vision, they understand what the project should be focused on, and they're ultimately the ones that have the great responsibility of deciding what's in and what's out. They also have the responsibility of managing and encouraging and exciting this community to keep them engaged. And it's important to know what role everybody falls in. So as you think about this in the context of your organization, establishing guidelines for who are your maintainers, who are your contributors, and who are your users are super important to make sure that we have the right workflow supporting these projects. The tenet of being collaborative. Within our organizations, I think about this in the context of informal teams. We have structured teams, but I think it's also important to have informal teams. And these teams are important because they can work together to solicit help, learn from others, and they can develop expertise. And let's look at an example of how this might flow out. Here's a traditional engineering team. You have Dev Group A, Dev Group B, Dev Group C, and these folks are all working together to drive towards a specific goal, a specific project, a specific product, a specific innovation, whatever that thing might be. These folks are organized to work together. But then we have these teams with a common interest, and we call these ad hoc teams. So these are folks that maybe sit within each of these groups, but they have a specific interest in JavaScript. These are your JavaScript developers, and you want to have an ad hoc team where these folks can come together, share best practices, and learn from each other and work together. You might also have an organizational security team. So these are the folks that within these teams are focused on application security, or they're focused on compliance, or whatever that project might be. You want to be able to connect those folks across the organization as well. You might also have folks who are interested in SQL, so thinking about database best practices. And you might have these people sitting in multiple ad hoc teams because they share these interests, but it's really important to be able to find a way to connect these groups and allow them to collaborate outside of the structure of their organization to bring the learnings across teams and make your entire development organization stronger. You might have somebody who reports to Dev Group A and part of security and SQL teams. Really, this is about their expertise and empowering them to be important parts of the broader organization. This is not only good from the context of making sure that you're sharing information, but also in terms of having happy developers. Developers that can share their expertise, share their knowledge, and share their understanding of how things work, and then learn from each other are happier developers. And happier developers are developers that are easier to retain, and happier developers are those developers that are doing their best work most efficiently. And lastly, let's talk about the government tenant. So this last piece is around policies and procedures. Maintainers focus on this aspect primarily. Good projects should have a way of reporting issues and how to contribute. This is sort of like documentation, but not about the code or the process of using the tool, but helping that along. So helping understand what are the rules, how should people contribute, and what's the code of conduct that people should be engaging in this project with. And the last piece of this is enforcement. We want to reduce the missteps by providing clear goals and support, and then we want to be able to make sure that there's some enforcement of those rules as well. A lot of the policies and procedures are enforced by the maintainers, or they're automated. There should be coordinated and well-defined roles for the user, for the contributor, for the core committer, for the mentor. Stewardship of the community for these projects, if they're big enough, is important and should be in the hands of the maintainers. So as you think about rolling projects internally into an inner-sourced model, again, putting the power of the maintainer in the hands of a core group of folks who are at the end of the day highly responsible for the project that are important to your organization, giving them the chance to establish the governance principles and enforce those, whether they be through manual processes or enforced through workflows that enforce specific areas of compliance or security testing. Really giving them this power is important. So I want to take a second to kind of look at the benefits of inner sourcing. So we've talked about kind of what inner sourcing is, and we've talked about what it takes to implement inner sourcing well. Here's some companies that have done it, and I'm not going to read all of this to you. It doesn't matter. You can read it yourself. But these are big companies who have figured out how to leverage inner sourcing within their organization, and they've seen great returns from just simple investment in inner sourcing. And I say a simple investment, but I'm kind of misleading you. It's not simple. Inner sourcing isn't, as I said before, just simply about tools or about processes. It's a combination of things that come together to enable your organization to work most effectively and work in a way that makes a lot of sense and keeps your developers happy. At the highest level, it's about culture. And this is a really important point because inner sourcing is about culture. It's not about, as I said, tools or processes or talent. It's about establishing a culture supported by the right tools and processes that empowers your developer talent to collaborate, iterate faster, ship more frequently, and stay in flow. And flow is a concept we haven't talked much about here today, but it's an interesting concept that essentially means that the more time your developer spends in a creative frame of mind, the more creative they can be and the more work they're going to get done faster, and the better the quality of that work is going to be. Oh, and by the way, it's not always easy to get into that flow state. So once you're there, you want them to stay there. And so this culture helps your developers get into that state of flow and stay in that state of flow as long as they possibly can. So while we're talking about culture, I also want to make sure it's really important to know that it starts at the top. This isn't a bottoms-up thing. You can't go out and ask your developers to start inner sourcing. This has to be something that starts at the top of your organization. It is a mandate. It is a set of beliefs and philosophies around building software that must be shared down through the organization and supported with a fervor at the top and through all of the management chains all the way down through your developers. Culture doesn't happen in pockets. Culture happens across the organization. And if you're a leader of a development team or an organization that has developer teams in it, know that inner sourcing and the ability to do this effectively starts with you. And here's some of the things that should be a part of this culture. Culturally, you should want to share, reuse, collaborate, learn, and automate. These should be all parts of how you think about building software. They should be kind of core to the way that you build, core to the way that you work, and ingrained in the minds of everybody in your team. Believe it or not, building these habits and these thoughts into how your developers work is probably less of a challenge than you think, because if they're already out working with GitHub and working on open source, this is how they're working today. So bring these practices that they're using in the open source community back into your organization and benefit from taking the processes that they use on their own time to help them make their lives easier while they're on your time. Another kind of set of philosophical things that you want to think about is you want to ship to learn. You ship software, you test it, you run it through user testing, you run it through security testing, and you learn from that, and then you iterate rapidly. You create feedback loops from your CI/CD deployments, from your customers, from your security tooling to help you iterate more rapidly and have more frequent deployments. If you look at kind of large organizations, some of the most effective organizations in the world have invested in more frequent deployments. Microsoft, in their efforts to increase the way that they focus on inner sourcing, have moved from semi-annual ships of software to shipping hundreds or thousands of times a day. The rate at which you can ship software and make incremental change to the code that your customers enjoy both allows you to bring innovation to your customers faster, but on the whole adds to the stability and performance benefits of your software. So moving to a frequent deployment model supported by automation, supported by CI/CD, and supported by the cloud ultimately will help both you and your organization, but also help your customers understand the value and differentiation you're bringing to them. And the last piece of this is developer-focused security. Building security into your workflows in a way that allows not only for your developers to catch vulnerabilities early so they can fix them, but also to give feedback loops so that users are able to more rapidly implement those changes as they're building code. So fix as you build is an important process for developers and developer-focused security. In the end, your philosophy should be to build better software faster. Leverage inner sourcing to get the best work out of your developers, to keep your developers happy, and to ensure that you're delivering the best possible experiences to your customers. So I'll close there. As I mentioned, my email is partnerguy@github.com. If you have questions, concerns, comments, or just want to talk about this stuff, please feel free to reach out. My email is open and I'm easy to find, so I'd love to hear from you. So thank you very much for talking with me today about the inner sourcing journey, and I hope that you enjoy the rest of this, the rest of the online forum, and I look forward to hopefully meeting some or all of you in person someday in the future.